Chapter 13, Major Redacted to Coverley. Moving the bomb line did not fool the Germans, but it did fool Major Redacted to Coverley, who packed his musette bag, commandeered an airplane, and, under the impression that Florence too had been captured by the Allies, had himself flown to that city to rent 2 apartments for the officers and the enlisted men in the squadron to use on rest leaves. He had still not returned by the time Yossarian jumped back outside Major Major's office and wondered whom to appeal to next for help. Major Redacted to Coverley was a splendid, awe-inspiring, grave old man with a massive leonine head and an angry shock of wild white hair that raged like a blizzard around his stern, patriarchal face. His duties as squadron executive officer did consist entirely, as both Dr. Nika and Major Major had conjectured, of pitching horseshoes, kidnapping Italian laborers, and renting apartments for the enlisted men and officers to use on rest leaves, and he excelled at all 3. Each time the fall of a city like Naples, Rome, or Florence seemed imminent, Major Redacted to Coverley would pack his musette bag, commandeer an airplane and a pilot, and have himself flown away, accomplishing all this without uttering a word, by the sheer force of his solemn, domineering visage and the peremptory gestures of his wrinkled finger. A day or 2 after the city fell, he would be back with leases on 2 large and luxurious apartments there, one for the officers and one for the enlisted men, both already staffed with competent, jolly cooks and maids. A few days after that, newspapers would appear throughout the world with photographs of the first American soldiers bludgeoning their way into the shattered city, through rubble and smoke. Inevitably, Major Redacted to Coverley was among them, seated straight as a ramrod in a jeep he had obtained from somewhere, glancing neither right nor left as artillery fire burst about his invincible head, and lithe young infantrymen with carbines went loping up along the sidewalks in the shelter of burning buildings or fell dead in doorways. He seemed eternally indestructible as he sat there surrounded by danger, his features molded firmly into that same fierce, regal, just, and forbidding countenance which was recognized and revered by every man in the squadron. To German intelligence, Major Redacted to Coverley was a vexatious enigma. Not one of the hundreds of American prisoners would ever supply any concrete information about the elderly, white-haired officer with the gnarled and menacing brow and blazing, powerful eyes, who seemed to spearhead every important advance so fearlessly and successfully. To American authorities, his identity was equally perplexing. A whole regiment of crack CID men had been thrown into the front lines to find out who he was, while a battalion of combat-hardened public relations officers stood on red alert 24 hours a day with orders to begin publicizing him the moment he was located. In Rome, Major Redacted to Coverley had outdone himself with the apartments. For the officers, who arrived in groups of 4 or 5, there was an immense double room for each in a new white stone building, with 3 spacious bathrooms with walls of shimmering aquamarine tile and one skinny maid named Mikola who tittered at everything and kept the apartment in spotless order. On the landing below lived the obsequious owners. On the landing above lived the beautiful, rich, black-haired countess and her beautiful, rich, black-haired daughter-in-law, both of whom would put out only for Nately, who was too shy to want them, and for Arfie, who was too stuffy to take them, but tried to dissuade them from ever putting out for anyone but their husbands, who had chosen to remain in the north with the family's business interests. They're really a couple of good kids, Arfie confided earnestly to Yossarian, whose recurring dream it was to have the nude, milk-white female bodies of both these beautiful, rich, black-haired good kids lying stretched out in bed erotically with him at the same time. The enlisted men descended upon Rome in gangs of 12 or more with gargantuan appetites and heavy crates filled with canned food for the women to cook and serve to them in the dining room of their own apartment on the 6th floor of a red brick building with a clinking elevator. There was always more activity in the enlisted men's place. There were always more enlisted men to begin with, and more women to cook and serve and sweep and scrub. And then there were always the gay and silly, sensual young girls that Yossarian had found and brought there, and those that the sleepy enlisted men returning to Pianosa after their exhausting 7-day debauch had brought there on their own, and were leaving behind for whoever wanted them next. The girls had shelter and food for as long as they wanted to stay. All they had to do in return was hump any of the men who asked them to, which seemed to make everything just about perfect for them. Every 4th day or so, Hungry Joe came crashing in like a man in torment, hoarse, wild, and frenetic. If he had been unlucky enough to finish his missions again and was flying the courier ship. Most times he slept at the enlisted men's apartment. Nobody was certain how many rooms Major Redacted de Coverley had rented, not even the stout black-bodiced woman in corsets on the first floor from whom he had rented them. They covered the whole top floor, and Yossarian knew they extended down to the fifth floor as well, for it was in Snowdon's room on the fifth floor that he had finally found the maid in the lime-colored panties with a dust mop the day after Bologna, after Hungry Joe had discovered him in bed with Luciana at the officer's apartment that same morning and had gone running like a fiend for his camera. The maid in the lime-colored panties was a cheerful, fat, obliging woman in her mid-30s with squashy thighs and swaying hams in lime-colored panties that she was always rolling off for any man who wanted her. She had a plain, broad face and was the most virtuous woman alive. She laid for everybody, regardless of race, creed, color, or place of national origin, donating herself sociably as an act of hospitality, procrastinating not even for the moment it might take to discard the cloth or broom or dust mop she was clutching at the time she was grabbed. Her allure stemmed from her accessibility. Like Mount Everest, she was there, and the men climbed on top of her each time they felt the urge. Yossarian was in love with the maid in the lime-colored panties because she seemed to be the only woman left he could make love to without falling in love with. Even the bald-headed girl in Sicily still evoked in him strong sensations of pity, tenderness, and regret. Despite the multiple perils to which Major Redacted de Coverley exposed himself each time he rented apartments, his only injury had occurred, ironically enough, while he was leading the triumphal procession into the open city of Rome, where he was wounded in the eye by a flower fired at him from close range by a seedy, cackling, intoxicated old man, who, like Satan himself, had bounded up on Major Redacted de Coverley's car with malicious glee, seized him roughly and contemptuously by his venerable white head, and kissed him mockingly on each cheek with a mouth reeking with sour fumes of wine, cheese, and garlic, before dropping back into the joyous celebrating throngs with a hollow, dry, excoriating laugh. Major Redacted de Coverley, a Spartan in adversity, did not flinch once throughout the whole hideous ordeal, and not until he had returned to Pianosa, his business in Rome completed, did he seek medical attention for his wound. He resolved to remain binocular and specified to Dr. Nika that his eye patch be transparent so that he could continue pitching horseshoes, kidnapping Italian laborers, and renting apartments with unimpaired vision. To the men in the squadron, Major Redacted de Coverley was a colossus, although they never dared tell him so. The only one who ever did dare address him was Milo Minderbinder, who approached the horseshoe pitching pit with a hard-boiled egg his second week in the squadron and held it aloft for Major Redacted de Coverley to see. Major Redacted de Coverley straightened with astonishment at Milo's effrontery and concentrated upon him the full fury of his storming countenance, with its rugged overhang of gullied forehead and huge crag of a humpbacked nose that came charging out of his face wrathfully like a Big Ten fullback. Milo stood his ground, taking shelter behind the hard-boiled egg raised protectively before his face like a magic charm. In time, the gale began to subside, and the danger passed. "What is that?" Major Redacted de Coverley demanded at last. "An egg," Milo answered. "What kind of an egg?" Major Redacted de Coverley demanded. "A hard-boiled egg," Milo answered. "What kind of a hard-boiled egg?" Major Redacted de Coverley demanded. "A fresh hard-boiled egg," Milo answered. "Where did the fresh egg come from?" Major Redacted de Coverley demanded. "From a chicken," Milo answered. "Where's the chicken?" Major Redacted de Coverley demanded. "The chicken is in Malta," Milo answered. "How many chickens are there in Malta?" "Enough chickens to lay fresh eggs for every officer in the squadron, at 5 cents apiece from the mess fund," Milo answered. "I have a weakness for fresh eggs," Major Redacted de Coverley confessed. "If someone put a plane at my disposal, I could fly down there once a week in a squadron plane and bring back all the fresh eggs we need," Milo answered. "After all, Malta's not so far away." "Malta's not so far away," Major Redacted de Coverley observed. "You could probably fly down there once a week in a squadron plane and bring back all the fresh eggs we need." "Yes," Milo agreed. "I suppose I could do that, if someone wanted me to and put a plane at my disposal." "I like fresh fried eggs," Major Redacted de Coverley remembered, "in fresh butter." "I can find all the fresh butter we need in Sicily for 25 cents a pound," Milo answered. 25 cents a pound for fresh butter is a good buy. There's enough money in the mess fund for butter, too, and we could probably sell some to the other squadrons at a profit and get back most of what we pay for our own. What's your name, son? Asked Major Redacted to Coverly. My name's Milo Minderbinder, sir. I am 27 years old. You're a good mess officer, Milo. I'm not the mess officer, sir. You're a good mess officer, Milo. Thank you, sir. I'll do everything in my power to be a good mess officer. Bless you, my boy. Have a horseshoe. Thank you, sir. What should I do with it? Throw it. Away? At that peg there. Then pick it up and throw it at this peg. It's a game, see? You get the horseshoe back. Yes, sir, I see. How much are horseshoes selling for? The smell of a fresh egg snapping exotically in a pool of fresh butter carried a long way on the Mediterranean trade winds and brought General Dreedle racing back with a voracious appetite, accompanied by his nurse, who accompanied him everywhere, and his son-in-law, Colonel Nudis. In the beginning, General Dreedle devoured all his meals in Milo's mess hall. Then the other 3 squadrons in Colonel Cathcart's group turned their mess halls over to Milo and gave him an airplane and a pilot each so he could buy fresh eggs and fresh butter for them too. Milo's plane shuttled back and forth 7 days a week as every officer in the 4 squadrons began devouring fresh eggs and in an insatiable orgy of fresh egg eating. General Dreedle devoured the fresh eggs for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Between meals, he devoured more fresh eggs, until Milo located abundant sources of fresh veal, beef, duck, baby lamb chops, mushroom caps, broccoli, South African lobster tails, shrimp, ham, pudding, grapes, ice cream, strawberries, and artichokes. There were 3 other bomb groups in General Dreedle's combat wing, and they each jealously dispatched their own planes to Malta for fresh eggs, but discovered that fresh eggs were selling there for 7 cents apiece. Since they could buy them from Milo for 5 cents apiece, it made more sense to turn over their mess halls to his syndicate too, and give him the planes and pilots needed to ferry in all the other good food he promised to supply as well. Everyone was elated with this turn of events, most of all Colonel Cathcart, who was convinced he had won a feather in his cap. He greeted Milo jovially each time they met and, in an excess of contrite generosity, impulsively recommended Major for promotion. The recommendation was rejected at once at 27th Air Force Headquarters by ex-PFC Wintergreen, who scribbled a brusque, unsigned reminder that the Army had only one Major, and did not intend to lose him by promoting him just to please Colonel Cathcart. Colonel Cathcart was stung by the blunt rebuke and skulked guiltily about his room in smarting repudiation. He blamed Major for this black eye and decided to bust him down to lieutenant that very same day. They probably won't let you, Colonel Corn remarked with a condescending smile, savoring the situation, for precisely the same reasons that they wouldn't let you promote him. Besides, you'd certainly look foolish trying to bust him down to lieutenant right after you tried to promote him to my rank. Colonel Cathcart felt hemmed in on every side. He had been much more successful in obtaining a medal for Yossarian after the debacle at Ferrara, when the bridge spanning the Po was still standing undamaged 7 days after Colonel Cathcart had volunteered to destroy it. 9 missions his men had flown there in 6 days, and the bridge was not demolished until the 10th mission on the 7th day, when Yossarian killed Kraft and his crew by taking his flight of 6 planes in over the target a second time. Yossarian came in carefully on his second bomb run because he was brave then. He buried his head in his bomb sight until his bombs were away. When he looked up, everything inside the ship was suffused in a weird orange glow. At first he thought his own plane was on fire. Then he spied the plane with the burning engine directly above him and screamed to McWatt through the intercom to turn left hard. A second later, the wing of Kraft's plane blew off. The flaming wreck dropped, first the fuselage, then the spinning wing, while a shower of tiny metal fragments began tap dancing on the roof of Yossarian's own plane, and the incessant ka-chung, ka-chung, ka-chung of the flak was still thumping all around him. Back on the ground, every eye watched grimly as he walked in dull dejection up to Captain Black outside the green clapboard briefing room to make his intelligence report, and learned that Colonel Cathcart and Colonel Corn were waiting to speak to him inside. Major Danby stood barring the door, waving everyone else away in ashen silence. Yossarian was leaden with fatigue and longed to remove his sticky clothing. He stepped into the briefing room with mixed emotions, uncertain how he was supposed to feel about Kraft and the others, for they had all died in the distance of a mute and secluded agony at a moment when he was up to his own ass in the same vile, excruciating dilemma of duty and damnation. Colonel Cathcart, on the other hand, was all broken up was all broken up by the event. Twice? He asked. I would have missed it the first time, Yossarian replied softly, his face lowered. Their voices echoed slightly in the long, narrow bungalow. But twice? Colonel Cathcart repeated in vivid disbelief. I would have missed it the first time, Yossarian repeated. But Kraft would be alive. And the bridge would still be up. A trained bombardier is supposed to drop his bombs the first time, Colonel Cathcart reminded him. The other 5 bombardiers dropped their bombs the first time. And missed the target, Yossarian said. We'd have had to go back there again. And maybe you would have gotten it the first time then. And maybe I wouldn't have gotten it at all. But maybe there wouldn't have been any losses. And maybe there would have been more losses, but with the bridge still left standing. I thought you wanted the bridge destroyed. Don't contradict me, Colonel Cathcart said. We're all in enough trouble. I'm not contradicting you, sir. Yes, you are. Even that's a contradiction. Yes, sir. I'm sorry. Colonel Cathcart cracked his knuckles violently. Colonel Corn, a stocky, dark, flaccid man with a shapeless paunch, sat completely relaxed on one of the benches in front of it, in the front row, his hands clasped comfortably over the top of his bald and swarthy head. His eyes were amused behind his glinting, rimless spectacles. We're trying to be perfectly objective about this, he prompted Colonel Cathcart. We're trying to be perfectly objective about this, Colonel Cathcart said to Yossarian with a zeal of sudden inspiration. It's not that I'm being sentimental or anything. I don't give a damn about the man or the airplane. It's just that it looks so lousy on the report. How am I going to cover up something like this in the report? Why don't you give me a medal? Yossarian suggested timidly. For going around twice? You gave one to Hungry Joe when he cracked up that airplane by mistake. Colonel Cathcart snickered ruefully. You'll be lucky if we don't give you a court-martial. But I got the bridge the second time around, Yossarian protested. I thought you wanted the bridge destroyed. Oh, I don't know what I wanted, Colonel Cathcart cried out in exasperation. Look, of course I wanted the bridge destroyed. That bridge has been a source of trouble to me ever since I decided to send you men out to get it. But why couldn't you do it the first time? I didn't have enough time. My navigator wasn't sure we had the right city. The right city? Colonel Cathcart was baffled. Are you trying to blame it all on Arfie now? No, sir. It was my mistake for letting him distract me. All I'm trying to say is that I'm not infallible. Nobody is infallible, Colonel Cathcart said sharply, and then continued vaguely with an afterthought. Nobody is indispensable either. There was no rebuttal. Colonel Corn stretched sluggishly. We've got to reach a decision, he observed casually to Colonel Cathcart. We've got to reach a decision, Colonel Cathcart said to Yossarian, and it's all your fault. Why did you have to go around twice? Why couldn't you drop your bombs the first time, like all the others? I would have missed the first time. It seems to me that we're going around twice, Colonel Corn interrupted with a chuckle. But what are we going to do? Colonel Cathcart exclaimed with distress. The others are all waiting outside. Why don't we give him a medal? Colonel Corn proposed. For going around twice? What can we give him a medal for? For going around twice, Colonel Corn answered with a reflective, self-satisfied smile. After all, I suppose it did take a lot of courage to go over that target a second time with no other planes around to divert the anti-aircraft fire. And he did hit the bridge. You know, that might be the answer, to act boastfully about something we ought to be ashamed of. That's a trick that never seems to fail. Too real. Do you think it will work? I'm sure it will. And let's promote him to captain, too, just to make certain. Don't you think that's going a bit farther than we have to? No, I don't think so. It's best to play safe. And captain's not much difference. All right, Colonel Cathcart decided. We'll give him a medal for being brave enough to go around over the target twice. And we'll make him a captain, too. Colonel Corn reached for his hat. Exit smiling, he joked, and put his arm around Yossarian's shoulders as they stepped outside the door. 14. Kid Sampson. By the time of the mission to Bologna, Yossarian was brave enough not to go around over the target even once, and when he found himself aloft, finally in the nose of Kid Sampson's plane, he pressed the button of his throat mic and asked, "Well, what's wrong with the plane?" Kid Sampson let out a shriek. "Is something wrong with the plane? What's the matter?" Kid Sampson's cry turned Yossarian to ice. "Is something the matter?" he yelled in horror. "Are we bailing out?" "I don't know," Kid Sampson shot back in English, wailing excitedly. "Somebody said we're bailing out. Who is this anyway? Who is this?" "This is Yossarian in the nose. Yossarian in the nose. I heard you say there was something the matter. Didn't you say there was something the matter?" "I thought you said there was something wrong. Everything seems okay. Everything is all right." Yossarian's heart sank. Something was terribly wrong if everything was all right, and they had no excuse for turning back. He hesitated gravely. "I can't hear you," he said. "I said everything is all right." The sun was blinding white on the porcelain blue water below, and on the flashing edges of the other planes. Yossarian took hold of the colored wires leading to his jackbox of the intercom system and tore them loose. "I still can't hear you," he said. He heard nothing. Slowly, he collected his map case and his 3 flak suits and crawled back to the main compartment. Nately, sitting stiffly in the co-pilot's seat, spied him through the corner of his eye and stepped up on the flight deck behind Kid Sampson. He smiled at Yossarian wanly, looking frail and exceptionally young and bashful in the bulky dungeon of his earphones, hat, throat mic, flak suit, and parachute. Yossarian bent close to Kid Sampson's ear. "I still can't hear you," he shouted above the even drone of the engines. Kid Sampson glanced back at him with surprise. Kid Sampson had an angular, comical face with arched eyebrows and a scrawny blonde mustache. "What?" he called out over his shoulder. "I still can't hear you," Yossarian repeated. "You'll have to talk louder," Kid Sampson said. "I still can't hear you." "I said I still can't hear you," Yossarian yelled. "I can't help it," Kid Sampson yelled back at him. "I'm shouting as loud as I can." "I couldn't hear you over my intercom," Yossarian bellowed in mounting helplessness. "You'll have to turn back." "For an intercom?" asked Kid Sampson incredulously. "Turn back," said Yossarian, "before I break your head." Kid Sampson looked for moral support toward Nately, who stared away from him pointedly. Yossarian outranked them both. Kid Sampson resisted doubtfully for another moment and then capitulated eagerly with a triumphant whoop. "That's just fine with me," he announced gladly, and blew out a shrill series of whistles up into his mustache. "Yes, sirree, that's just fine with old Kid Sampson." He whistled again and shouted over the intercom. "Now hear this, my little chickadees. This is Admiral Kid Sampson talking. This is Admiral Kid Sampson squawking, the pride of the Queen's Marines. Yes, sirree. We're turning back, boys. By cracky, we're turning back." Nately ripped off his hat and earphones in one jubilant sweep and began rocking back and forth happily like a handsome child in a high chair. Sergeant Knight came plummeting down from the top gun turret and began pounding them all on the back with delirious enthusiasm. Kid Sampson turned the plane away from the formation in a wide, graceful arc and headed toward the airfield. When Yossarian plugged his headset into one of the auxiliary jackboxes, the 2 gunners in the rear section of the plane were both singing La Cucaracha. Back at the field, the party fizzled out abruptly. An uneasy silence replaced it, and Yossarian was sober and self-conscious as he climbed down from the plane and took his place in the jeep that was already waiting for them. None of the men spoke at all on the drive back through the heavy, mesmerizing quiet blanketing mountains, sea, and forests. The feeling of desolation persisted when they turned off the road at the squadron. Yossarian got out of the car last. After a minute, Yossarian and a gentle, warm wind were the only things stirring in the haunting tranquility that hung like a drug over the vacated tents. The squadron stood insensate, bereft of everything human but Doc Danica, who roosted dolorously like a shivering turkey buzzard while beside the closed door of the medical tent, his stuffed nose jabbing away in thirsting futility at the hazy sunlight streaming down around him. Yossarian knew Doc Danica would not go swimming with him. Doc Danica would never go swimming again. A person could swoon or suffer mild coronary occlusion in an inch or 2 of water and drown to death, be carried out to sea by an undertow, or made vulnerable to poliomyelitis or meningococcus infection through chilling or overexertion. The threat of Bologna to others had instilled in Dr. Nika an even more poignant solicitude for his own safety. At night now, he heard burglars. Through the lavender gloom clouding the entrance of the operations tent, Yossarian glimpsed Chief White Half-Oat, diligently embezzling whiskey rations, forging the signatures of non-drinkers and pouring off the alcohol with which he was poisoning himself into separate bottles rapidly in order to steal as much as he could before Captain Black roused himself with recollection and came hurrying over indolently to steal the rest himself. The jeep started up again softly. Kid Sampson, Nately, and the others wandered apart in a noiseless eddy of motion and were sucked away into the cloying yellow stillness. The jeep vanished with a cough. Yossarian was alone in a ponderous primeval lull in which everything green looked black and everything else was imbued with the color of pus. The breeze rustled leaves in a dry and diaphanous distance. He was restless, scared, and sleepy. The sockets of his eyes felt grimy with exhaustion. Wearily, he moved inside the parachute tent with its long table of smoothed wood, a nagging bitch of doubt burrowing painlessly inside a conscience that felt perfectly clear. He left his flak suit and parachute there and crossed back past the water wagon to the intelligence tent to return his map case to Captain Black, who sat drowsing in his chair with his skinny long legs up on his desk and inquired with indifferent curiosity why Yossarian's plane had turned back. Yossarian ignored him. He set the map down on the counter and walked out. Back in his own tent, he squirmed out of his parachute harness and then out of his clothes. Orr was in Rome, due back that same afternoon from the rest leave he had won by ditching his plane in the waters off Genoa. Nately would already be packing to replace him, entranced to find himself still alive and undoubtedly impatient to resume his wasted and heartbreaking courtship of his prostitute in Rome. When Yossarian was undressed, he sat down on his cot to rest. He felt much better as soon as he was naked. He never felt comfortable in clothes. In a little while, he put fresh undershorts back on and then set out for the beach in his moccasins, a khaki-colored bath towel draped over his shoulders. The path from the squadron led him around a mysterious gun emplacement into the woods. 2 of the 3 enlisted men stationed there lay sleeping on a circle of sandbags, and the 3rd sat eating a purple pomegranate, biting off large mouthfuls between his churning jaws and spewing the ground roughage out away from him into the bushes. When he bit, red juice ran out of his mouth. Yossarian padded ahead into the forest again, caressing his bare, tingling belly adoringly from time to time, as though to reassure himself it was still there. He rolled a piece of lint out of his navel. Along the ground suddenly, on both sides of the path, he saw dozens of new mushrooms the rain had spawned, poking their nodular fingers up through the clammy earth like lifeless stalks of flesh, sprouting in such necrotic profusion everywhere he looked, that they seemed to be proliferating right before his eyes. There were thousands of them swarming as far back into the underbrush as he could see, and they appeared to swell in size and multiply in number as he spied them. He hurried away from them with a shiver of eerie alarm and did not slacken his pace until the soil crumbled to dry sand beneath his feet and they had been left behind. He glanced back apprehensively, half expecting to find the limp white things crawling after him in sightless pursuit, or snaking up through the treetops in a writhing and ungovernable mutative mass. The beach was deserted. The only sounds were hushed ones, the bloated gurgle of the stream, the respirating hum of the tall grass and the shrubs behind him, the apathetic moaning of the dumb, translucent waves. The surf was always small, the water clear at the pool. Yossarian left his things on the sand and moved through the knee-high waves until he was completely immersed. On the other side of the sea, a bumpy sliver of dark land lay wrapped in mist, almost invisible. He swam languorously out to the raft, held on a moment, and swam languorously back where he could stand on the sandbar. He submerged himself headfirst into the green water several times until he felt clean and wide awake, and then stretched himself out face down in the sand and slept until the planes returning from Bologna were almost overhead, and the great cumulative rumble of their many engines came crashing in through his slumber in an earth-shattering roar. He woke up blinking with a slight pain in his head and opened his eyes upon a world boiling in chaos in which everything was in proper order. He gasped in utter amazement at the fantastic sight of the 12 flights of planes organized calmly into exact formation. The scene was too unexpected to be true. There were no planes spurting ahead with wounded, none lagging behind with damage. No distress flares smoked in the sky. No ship was missing but his own. For an instant, he was paralyzed with the sensation of madness. Then he understood and almost wept at the irony. The explanation was simple. Clouds had covered the target before the planes could bomb it, and the mission to Bologna was still to be flown. He was wrong. There had been no clouds. Bologna had been bombed. Bologna was a milk run. There had been no flak there at all.